Welcome, everyone, to today's joint Endowment for Middle East Truth and Scholars for Peace in the Middle East webinar discussing anti-Semitism, ideologies, and institutions that help further the hate, featuring my esteemed colleagues from Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, Richard Landes and Asaf Romirowsky. We could spend hours having Richard and Asaf discuss the topic, all of the topics that we're going to cover today, but we only have 1 hour, so I'm going to make this introduction very brief and forgo a formal introduction of our panelists. Their bios were included in the invitation to this event, and you can learn more about them by also visiting www.spme.org. As always, I thank you all for joining and for supporting us. We couldn't do our very important work if it were not for your generous support, so please do consider visiting both SPME's website and Emmett's at www.emmettonline.org to make a year-end donation as well. Today's webinar will be recorded, and the link for viewing will be sent around tomorrow. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type them in. I'll do my best to get to as many of them as possible later in the program. We all know that anti-Semitism has been flourishing across the country, and it's quite frightening. While FBI statistics on hate crimes continually reflect that Jews are targeted significantly greater than any other religious group, their most recent stats didn't even include the country's 3 cities with the largest Jewish populations, Los Angeles, Miami, and New York, where so many hate crimes against Jews occur. And while we all focus on college campuses and on right-wing extremists, the anti-Semitism has seeped into just about every major institution in the country. In fact, I haven't seen a lot of coverage of this, but in a very disturbing, relatively new survey, 1/4 of hiring managers say they are less likely to move forward with Jewish applicants. 23% said they want fewer Jews in their industry, while 17% add that managers have told them to avoid hiring Jews. The top reason for discriminating against Jews, the results show, is a supposed fear of their, quote, power and control, with 38% of hiring managers citing that excuse. Recruiters also justify discrimination by claiming that Jews consider themselves the chosen people and they have too much wealth, in addition to listing that Jews are greedy, Jews killed Jesus, Jews are an inferior race, Jews are oppressors, and Jews are less capable. This is starting to sound like pre-World War II Nazi Germany, and as I said, is extremely frightening. So on that note, Asaf, I want to start by asking you to spend a few minutes discussing traditional anti-Semitism versus what we refer to today as the new anti-Semitism in the context of the growing Jew hatred that we see on both the right and the left. I would personally argue that while most Jews, and actually everyone who leans left in both their politics and ideological values, wrongly focus solely on anti-Semitism on the right and white supremacists in particular, the anti-Semitism we see on the left is far more dangerous and insidious. But we're also seeing an alignment of right-wing Jew haters and Black anti-Semites, for instance, with the best example, of course, being Kanye West and Nick Fuentes. I know we could spend hours on this, but if you could just spend some time discussing this generally as a lead into a more specific conversation, that would be great.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Lori. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always an honor to be with Richard, as always, and to share the podium with the panel with both of you. Just a few, observations as far as what we're seeing. I mean, I think at the concept of new versus old, I kind of reject that, idea of new and old. I mean, I think what we have here is it's always been the longest hatred that it's been defined by most scholars in the field. It's a repackaging of what we have here. And the repackaging kind of took place post 1948, that Israel in many regards and Jews by extension became the target of all the old anti-Semitic tropes that you go back to the medieval times, going back to Nazi times, and this kind of repackaging over and over again still maintains the Jew and it's all its forms as really the quintessential evil. And so you have this repackaging. What we have in the West, and I think this is where much of this debate is taking place today, and specifically in North America, is the ongoing question, which I think all of us agree on, is whether or not anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. And so we have this debate where those who would like to argue that they are not anti-Semitic, i.e. that they are not racist, they are only anti-Zionist, they try to distinguish between the two terminologies. I would argue, and even Natan Sharansky of late has been asked about the current environment, would argue that anti-Zionism is 100% anti-Semitic and vice versa. They are indeed synonymous. Where I think what we are seeing today a growth through these different manifestations of anti-Semitism has to do with the groups that we're seeing out there that are utilizing it to promote their own agenda. Under the auspices of intersectionality, groups like Black Lives Matter in particular, the Women's March, LGBTQ and whatnot, have all adopted their cause, has been somehow embodied within the Palestinian narrative, and thereby also their hatred towards the root cause of all the problems reside within Jews at large. And so we're seeing this quintessential hatred all being codified within the Jew itself. I think that the other challenge that we're facing at large today, and this is also probably something that is also worth devoting an entire lecture to, but we probably don't have time today, is of course how all this affects the fragmentation within the American Jewish community. And so this is another aspect that plays into the conversation. You have many Jews out there who will argue that I am Jewish, but, and there goes the narrative. And so the I'm Jewish, but is indeed a problem with the growing animosity towards the state of Israel. And you're seeing it today with different segments of the American Jewish left. As a result of the latest elections in Israel, you're seeing it towards their ability to why hate because of what their perception of how Israel treats the Palestinians. The religiosity of the day, and I think that in American society at large, is a very religious society, but the religion of today, I would say, focuses on two aspects. One has to do with the environment, and secondly, with human rights. And so when you look at those two terminologies, or those two kind of congregations, we are teaching our kids to believe in these universal values. And the concept of Israel and the concept of Jew and Jewish identity does not go hand in hand with that. So they are first and foremost ready to throw away their Jewish identity in lieu of basically, saying that they are more humanist, that they're more global, that they're more environmental and whatnot. And that is a major contributing factor to what you see on American college campuses, which I know we're going to get to later on in the conversation. But I think that those are the key elements to play into this conversation. But the hatred itself, as Richard, in a magnificent way details in his book, goes back to ancient times and medieval times. The millennial hatred that you see here has always been the same hatred. What I would argue is that the repackaging in this and the volume that we're seeing now growing vis-a-vis social media and every other aspect that you see out there, that rapid response and what you're seeing play out in the biases that we find in the media in order to give cover to the hatred is really our biggest concern. And when you talk about Kanye West and Nick Fuentes and whatnot, those really are individuals who have a massive following on social media. So don't confuse me with the facts, of course, is the constant guiding line here. But people who are following them are hating Jews based on their perceptions, but not necessarily about reality. But that is a major contributing factor to what we're seeing in the arts, in the humanities, in cultural avenues, and of course in the academy, that are all lending themselves to the growing hatred. So let me stop there, and we can take it from there.
Thanks, Asaf. There's a lot packed in there, and yeah, we could talk about so many aspects of this that I appreciate you covering as much as you did, including the divide within the Jewish community, which is, as you point out, certainly worthy of another discussion another time. Richard, I want to spend a few minutes discussing Islamism and anti-Semitism in the Muslim community. Hatred of Jews among Muslims seemed limited to the Middle East until 9/11, and the immigration of, thereafter, the immigration of Muslims from the Mideast and North African countries into the West and across Europe and the US. We now have Muslim members of Congress not just demonizing Israel, but spouting anti-Semitic blood libels, all while sitting on important committees that play a role in US foreign policy. Can you provide some background on this? And do you think any of this can be stemmed or reversed, or do you believe that Western civilization is in decline with the help of Muslim anti-Semitism, and that once anti-Semitism rears its ugly head and is permitted to flourish, bad things happen to civilizations at large?
Right. Well, certainly, I would say, and one of the themes in my book is that you're dealing with a situation in which Jews, as the saying goes, are only the first victims of anti-Semitism. The German people were clearly a major victim of the anti-Semitism that swept their society. But more generally, what I argue in the book is that it's anti-Semitism through which jihadis are able to invade the West. In other words, that's the soft spot of Western society, and the attraction that certain groups, including the intellectual leaders of the West, have, the attraction they have for what I call moral Schadenfreude about the Jews, this delight that you take in the shaming of the Jews with bad news, news of Jews behaving badly and so on, has been a major flaw in the West's ability to resist jihad. And it does that through this, what I call lethal journalism of reporting news about the Jews, killing Muhammad al Durah, the massacres of Jenin. I have a chapter on each one of them. It's a means of spreading hatred of Jews. And I think that there's a new dimension that deserves to be attended to, and that is that a lot of the anti-Zionist or a lot of the anti-Semitic libels would circulate through rumor and through various kinds of forgeries and so on. What's happened in the 21st century is that the anti-Semitic libels have spread via trusted mainstream news media, so that there's this kind of objective dimension to it that I think in the past didn't have quite the same pull. And as a result, in ways that, I think with the exception of Nazi Germany, didn't happen in democracies, the sort of major leading lights of academia and of journalism and pundits, in many cases, they're in total denial about this, and in many cases, they're unconscious of what they're doing, but they're in fact carrying all of these Jew-hating memes with them and spreading it throughout the society. So here, I think, your point about the problem of left-wing or anti-Semitism coming from the left being more dangerous than anti-Semitism coming from the right has a great deal to recommend it. And interestingly enough, part of what's so bizarre is I just posted to my class list, which is full of sort of 60s retreads. I posted a review of David Bernstein's book, Woke Anti-Semitism. And the response was just universally, oh no, woke isn't a problem for the Jews. The problem is all from the right. They're the ones with the weapons. They're the ones who are going to kill and so on. And it's just a total denial of the fact that some of the major instruments in the public sphere are consciously or unconsciously, in many cases in denial, spreading anti-Jewish, Jew-hating memes. Now, as for Muslims, I think it's important to understand two things. One, the spread of the real sort of, shall we say, flourishing of Muslim anti-Semitism in its most virulent forms, was largely a Middle Eastern phenomenon. A lot of the Nazis fled to Egypt and Syria. A lot of the anti-Israel, Arab anti-Israel propaganda was in fact formulated by ex-Nazis or by Nazis who had fled, surviving Nazis. And then it took in the 90s in an apocalyptic discourse that's covered by a colleague of mine named David Cook, wrote a book called Contemporary Muslim Apocalyptic. And there the anti-Semitism is ferocious. And it spread to the West really starting in 1979, which is 1400 in the Muslim calendar, and it spread via Saudi Arabia. And that basically moved into the Western mosques. And for 20 years before, with the Muhammad al Durah story, which I argue is the first successful blood libel in the West since the Holocaust, that sort of burst into the public discourse, not only amongst the left, which embraced it and said this image erases the picture of the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto with his hands up and so on, but also within the Muslim community in the West. So now we're dealing with a very serious problem, and I would argue one of the most dangerous parts of the leftist unconscious or denied Jew hatred is that they are either formally or informally closely allied with the Islamists.
Thank you, Richard. You covered a lot, and if we had time, I would follow up with so many of the points that you raised, but maybe we'll have time at the end to come back to some of this. Asaf, I want to turn to academia. I don't think there's a day that goes by that we don't look at our inboxes and see a report of yet another anti-Semitic incident occurring on campus, from BDS resolutions to swastikas on dorm room doors, from Harvard, which was just ranked as the worst school in the country for Jewish students, to UC campuses across the country. Anti-Semitism is flourishing, which is why SPME publishes a monthly BDS newsletter and holds monthly webinars on the topic. In fact, you were on a panel last week at CUNY, where you were shouted down by protesters until the police came to escort the protesters out, which is a common occurrence wherever a pro-Israel speaker is invited to a campus. Our focus at SPME is on faculty. And while we could spend several hours discussing academia alone, I'd like you to share with our viewers your thoughts on how this has developed, why it's allowed to continue, and what you think can be done, if anything, to stem the tide and finally put an end to this on campuses.
How much time do we have? I mean, you're right to point out, I mean, everything you're saying is absolutely correct. I mean, the historically speaking, I mean, the Palestinianization of the academy, you know, and to Richard's point about the involvement in Saudi Arabia goes back to the 1960s. I mean, you've seen here an evolution similar to the Soviet model of the hijacking of what I would consider to be agents of soft power, academia, the media, all the areas that we tackle. And post 1967 in particular, we've seen a growth of hijacking of chairs, centers, and departments, with the idea that if you give a gift from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or elsewhere or anywhere else, you also buy the politics in which these topics are being taught. So you've seen a growth of creating what I would consider to be the foundation for how these topics are being taught. Add that to the level of the involvement of individuals like Edward Said, you've seen really the majority of individuals, whether or not they teach about the topic or actually are subject matter experts, if they are from Arab or Palestinian descent, they have a very clear viewpoint on how these topics should be taught. And that became part of the orthodoxy of the day. So by the time BDS and its, you know, what I would consider to be in its modern day repackaging or reimplementation on the campuses as a result of Durban and repackaging this narrative, they've already fed into a pre-existing infrastructure where you already had professors and graduate students who already been taught and teaching based on this narrative. So it wasn't a new thing, but we basically fed into a pre-existing infrastructure that has grown exponentially, you know, with the growth of the BDS narrative. What you have seen here is, and going back to my earlier point, is that somehow, as a result of all this, the Palestinian cause has become the gold standard of all oppressed groups in the humanities in particular. Though I would argue today that maybe we could say 10 years ago, you had some kind of division between the STEM areas and the humanities. We've crossed that barrier a long time ago. And the same biases that you find in the humanities also trickle down into the humanities. You might remember, and I'm sure Richard does as well, when we were talking about what happened with Lancet, the medical magazine that was going around, where you talked about the old anti-Semitic tropes that were positioned into the conflict from a prestigious medical journal about harvesting of organs by Israelis and things of the sort. Again, all fiction, but have been able to get published in a medical journal. At the time, the editor eventually got to Rambam Hospital, where he saw the amount of Arab doctors. He didn't rescind all his comment, but he acknowledged that there was a shred of Arab collaboration inside of Israeli hospitals, and so that was something. But the academic environment today that we're looking at, the only lens, apropos the religiosity in which these topics are being discussed, is only through the lens of BDS. And that's part of a degradation of the academy at large. I mean, case in point, we've talking about the fact that we've marked 2 years of the anniversary of the Abraham Accords. They've made little to no difference, moving the needle a little bit as far as what is actually happening on the ground. One of the main causes and one of the main driving forces of the boycott movement is anti-normalization. And the anti-normalization aspect is to basically single out the Jew, again, going back to the old anti-Semitic hatred, making Israel and all Jews seem abnormal. And by the way, just to make it, on your point about left and right, when you're targeted on campus, nobody's asking you to say, are you a left-wing Jew or a right-wing Jew? You're targeted because you're being Jewish and who you are. There was actually an article that came out yesterday in the Wall Street Journal that actually interviewed some Jewish students, and they said, one of the Jewish students that was interviewed said that somebody yelled out of the car at her saying, hey, you're Jewish. And again, targeting somebody not because of their political leanings, but because of who they are and what they represent. So the academy has been hijacked with this kind of narrative. And what we're finding is that, and you were correct to point out, we deal with faculty at large. Faculty who stand up, really not about, even if they're not, ardently pro-Zionist, but just honest. We're talking about academic honesty. We're lacking honesty and academic integrity, where I would argue that up until the 90s, even individuals would say they would have at least some kind of balanced syllabi. Today, nobody even bothers to show balanced syllabi whatsoever. And we saw that with Orientalism as far as Said and showing them throwing in or peppering a little bit of Bernard Lewis. Today, there's no illusions about that. They do none of the above. And they keep on teaching polemics and propaganda rather than facts. And so faculty that all of us know and care about, who step up and talk about these issues honestly, are being targeted. They're being threatened. There's threats of violent threats, academic promotions. And so part of what we are trying to do, as all of us know, is trying to maintain and hold the academy to the standards of balance, basic balance that is lacking in the academy today. And we have a significant network. In our network, we have close to 40,000 individuals, but we're talking about millions on the other side. I mean, we're talking about the numbers of how this plays out, not to mention what is in the pipeline. And so we need to help. We need to restore the academy to what it's supposed to be like. Again, I think that if the academy was supposed to be to feed individuals what they, and to cajole their ideas, then what is the academy about? You could just go to Tehran and any university in the Middle East and have a one-sided, viewpoint. We need to talk about the exchange of ideas, discourse, which is what is being shut down as a result of cancel culture. What my experience was in New York last week was very simple. Interestingly enough, our colleague Donna Devine said this out loud in the beginning of the conversation. Why don't you come in here and discourse and talk about the ideas? And the protesters' response was no discourse. We don't want to hear anything. Again, the ongoing consistent dogma of don't confuse me with the facts is so pervasive. And so in a nutshell, that's what we're seeing here. And many of us, and I'm sure, have all been targeted because of raising the flag or saying something that is inconvenient to the orthodoxy. Today, the classic response is if you don't like what you hear, you shut it down, rather than engaging in conversation and discourse, which is what are the basic tenets of the liberal Western university. And that should be our concern. because what we're seeing today, and apropos the Harvard comment, and I'll stop, I know Richard has a response, is the fact that that was a lens into the leadership of American society. And if you're talking about that being a lens to what is going into individuals who are going to go into the politics, into academia, and what they think and believe about, that is something we should be concerned about, because that is exactly what they are teaching their kids and what we will see going forward that is leading to public officials and policies. And it's also trickling down, of course, into the business world. These are all the spheres we should be concerned about as it relates to maintaining America what it should be. So I'll stop there. I know, Richard, you wanted to comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point, which is an ironic point, which is that, the postmodern, post-fact approach was to say we have to be open to other narratives. We have to abandon the grand narrative, and we have to listen to other people's narratives. And what happened was, in the case of the Palestinians, is that the left opened itself up to the Palestinian narrative, which was in fact a pre-modern narrative. It was its own grand narrative. And what you have now is, instead of people listening to multiple narratives, they've been colonized by this Palestinian narrative, which is actually pre-modern. And so they behave in pre-modern ways. And as a result, Western academia, certainly when it concerns Israel, looks a whole lot more like academia in the pre-modern Arab world than it does like an open society, which is what created Western academia in the first place.
Yeah, 100%.
Thank you both. I would also argue that part of the issue is that on college campuses, every demographic is a protected class except for Jews and white people. And it's because Jews look like white people, even though Jews are people of color as well. And, they're not recognized as such, so they're not protected, but there is certainly an anti-Semitic aspect to it as well. Richard.
Yeah, we certainly were people of color to the Nazis.
Right, exactly.
And by the way, that's the debate on every college, debate by every Jewish individual on campus that we've been trying to deal with. A, we have to prove that we're minorities, and B, that anti-Semitism is racism. And on both accounts, we've been able to fail because we are seen as upper white middle class, and we are not qualified as a minority. That's one of our biggest challenges. So
we're white adjacent because we're successful.
Right.
So Richard, I want to move to a discussion now about the media's role in the rise of anti-Semitism, and in particular anti-Zionism, which is anti-Semitism. In a recent review of your new book, Can the Whole World Be Wrong? Lethal Journalism, Antisemitism, and Global Jihad, which I encourage everyone to read, by the way, as it's a long time coming, and it's invaluable in understanding the struggle that we face. And we're going to put the link to that in the chat if people want to purchase a copy of that. In any event, so in your review of your new book, our dear friend Phyllis Chesler wrote, quote, "From the moment Yasser Arafat launched his long-planned second intifada against Israel in 2000, the most brazen lies about both Jews and Israel were relentlessly told and widely believed. For years, master propagandists in cyberspace, the Western media, and academia managed to diabolically invert reality. The entire world believed an utterly false narrative," end quote. We just discussed academia, but can you discuss the role of the media in perpetuating the lies about Israel and Jews? I would argue both the academy and the media are brainwashing generations in a very frightening and dangerous fashion.
Right. So, one of the subtitles of my book is Lethal Journalism, which I define as reporting one side's war propaganda as news. In general, Western journalism, like Western academia, was supposed to be committed to not falling into the trap of reporting propaganda as fact. In fact, that's what distinguished the West and Western journalism. And indeed, one of the things that Western journalism tried to do was to separate itself even from patriotic war journalism, which is reporting news. And journalists were proud, particularly in the Vietnam War, that they weren't just parroting the American propaganda position, but they were reporting as they thought more honestly. Now, what happened here is that journalists, and this really, I mean, it happened before, it happened during the, if you read Tom Friedman's book, you can see how he got sucked into it in Beirut during the Sabra and Shatila massacre. It happened during the first Intifada, but starting with the second Intifada, it really seized the entire legacy journalist community, so that you had a sort of across the boards acceptance of Palestinian claims as true. And the pattern was you report the Palestinian claims as either believable or in fact true until they're disproven. You dismiss Israeli denials as propaganda until they're proven true. And then instead of actually changing your tune, you just look for the next lethal narrative. So the Muhammad al Durah story is my first chapter, and it's a terrible story, and it had a terrible impact both on the West and on the Muslim world. It was one of the major spurs to global jihad and to its positive reception in the West, which you saw at Durban, for example, where in fact there were pictures of bin Laden being carried around to right up to the end of that Durban conference, the UN conference in South Africa. And then 3 days later, bin Laden struck on 9/11. So on the one hand, you have this sort of across the boards acceptance of Palestinian lethal narratives. And you have to understand that means jihadi lethal narratives, and that means global jihadi lethal narratives. I mean, bin Laden recruited with the al Durah story. Al Durah was the patron saint of the Durban gathering and so on. So once you have that, it's very hard to resist. And by and large, I think Asaf was trying to get at this, you know, professors, Jewish professors and Jewish public figures were reluctant to fight back. I tried very hard with the Jewish community to get them to fight back against the al Durah thing. And their response was, look, the Israelis aren't fighting back, and we're afraid that if we do fight back, we'll look like, you know, we're conspiracy theorists. And as a result, I think the mainstream news media has played an enormous role in the spread of negative attitudes towards Jews, largely without recognizing it, and in many cases, in total denial.
I actually gave up my New York Times subscription, I think in 2003, and I had people, I would commute on the train and people would look at me like I had 10 heads for not reading the New York Times. And I get articles in my inbox, I see what they're writing, and it's
right.
Quite
and that's, and 2003 is right after Jenin. It's right after the Jenin massacre, which was a massive wave, and also a massive wave of hostility and attacks on Jews, the beginning of BDS in England and so on. And the real, I mean, there was, you know, the denial on the part of the Western community, including Jews, was really stunning. There was an article in the New Republic by somebody whose writing I love and who I respect enormously, Leon Wieseltier, who wrote, "Hitler is dead. Stop, you know, claiming that anti-Semitism is coming." But, you know, in fact, that was the beginning of what we're seeing now continuing to gather strength. And the fact that a kid can go to college today and be in an atmosphere where accusations that Israelis kill Palestinian kids every day can pass uncontradicted, because any contradiction is a form of racism and an attempt to silence Palestinian criticism of Israel, that was born in 2000. In some senses, my book is an effort to say to people, young people with progressive values, look, if you want to understand how the world got as crazy as it is, find out what happened in 2000, 2001, 2002. And understand that, what's happened is a profound corruption. Asaf is right. Academia has been corrupted. It had already been deeply corrupted before 2000 by the effects of Edward Said, but our whole public sphere has been corrupted by this insane attack on Jews as, essentially our misfortune.
Yeah. Asaf, one of your areas of expertise is the United Nations, and in particular, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA, as we all know it, which provides assistance for Palestinian refugees, as that term is so broadly defined. There's no way to talk about anti-Semitism without discussing the UN, which continually demonizes Israel, passing resolution after resolution, condemning the only Jewish state and democracy in the Middle East, while ignoring human rights abuses by the likes of Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea. And it was just reported that the individual tasked by the UN Human Rights Council with probing alleged Israeli violations against the Palestinians has previously said that the Jewish lobby controls the United States and compared Israelis to Nazis. This international hatred of the Jewish homeland used to be checked by the US at the UN, but under the Obama and Biden administrations, it seems the US is beginning to side with the Palestinians in the global condemnation of Israel choir. How concerned should we be?
Well, it depends on how much you care about what the UN thinks or doesn't think about altogether as far as a body. But all joking aside, and to Richard's point, I think it's also worth noting. First of all, Richard is absolutely correct that, of course, 2000 was a huge benchmark. But we've seen since the beginning of 48 a Holocaust inversion into the Arab-Israeli conflict. I mean, it's been obviously grown exponentially with every possible vehicle and medium out there to depict Israelis as Nazis and refugee camps as concentration camps and whatnot. And when you look at institutions like the United Nations, let me just put out, of course, the ongoing conundrum. For the state of Israel, Israel has a kind of obviously a love-hate relationship with the United Nations, because it's the same body that recognized their right to exist as far as going back to 1947. That being said, the United Nations in its early days was actually comprised of democracies or that basically or believed in democratization, whereas today it's become a voice for all totalitarian voices, illustrated by every group out there and country that you correctly identified, Lori, as on the Human Rights Council, China, Syria, Sudan, and whatnot. And so that's where the change in the United Nations has played out. But the religiosity and the Palestinianization of the United Nations has no end. And this is where they live and breathe. We've seen it going back to Abbas and Arafat using the United Nations as a vehicle to parachute a Palestinian narrative. Abbas declared unilateral declaration of independence, where the United Nations is going to automatically parachute a state of Palestine. But the Committee on the Inalienable Rights of Palestinian Rights and Palestinian Statehood goes back to the 1960s. And so this is not a new thing. However, the UNRWA as an agency has been the gatekeeper of all these Palestinian issues, and they have been able to liberally, and I would say this in the most kindest way, I guess, in the most expansive way possible, expand the definition of who is an Arab Palestinian refugee to a point where everybody's an Arab Palestinian refugee, all demanding a so-called right of return. Arab Palestinians are defined by UNRWA as anybody who was in 1946 to 1948, so pre-state Palestine, and the kicker, of course, is their descendants. In the 60s and 70s, Muslim lineage was only based on patriarchal. They've been able to expand to make it matriarchal, and they've also doubled the numbers, they resurrected dead, and so you have numbers growing left and right, all calling for a full right of return. And that is basically demographically the annihilation of the state of Israel by demographic means. I have argued over the years in all my writings that this is the number one issue that prevents, by design, any kind of resolution between Israelis and Palestinians. And it also proves that the conflict has nothing to do with territorial issues, but basically Palestinian identity is synonymous to Palestinian refugees, and everybody's a Palestinian refugee. And that is how the narrative has been cascaded in the halls of the United Nations. So they put out a lot of smoke, but the United Nations, and up until the Trump administration came to office, and now under the Biden administration, there has been a renewal of funding for UNRWA. Historically speaking, in the United States, up until Trump, and again was renewed again now under the Biden administration, constitutes about a third of UNRWA's annual budget, amounts historically to about $400 million of US taxpayer dollars. They lobby in Washington. These are all the vehicles that put out this kind of information. So it's no surprise. And the anti-Israel resolutions focused on violations of so-called human rights versus what is going on everywhere around the world, not to mention China and Syria and anywhere else, shows the hypersensitive focus of these kind of bodies that play out. I would love to hear also, apropos, these kind of perceptions and bias in the media, Richard's comment, a little bit, maybe knowledge about how he sees the latest about Shireen Abu Lika as another kind of a successor of al Durah. But you have these kind of biases and this kind of data by the human rights community, by UNRWA and by others. They're the ones who are projecting this fallacious narrative, but the narrative of the victim and the eternal victim that is embodied within the Palestinians. And the perception in the West, and if you use the terminology of refuginess, statelessness, the perception is people fleeing for their lives without running water, let alone Wi-Fi, and that is the fallacious imagery that they have as it relates to Arab Palestinian refugees. The only real time that you saw some kind of I would say, reality came during the so-called the Arab Spring, where you had Syrians fleeing for their lives and being massacred by the Assad regime, and then they went to UNRWA offices and they were shut down because they were not true Palestinians. Interestingly enough, but we can, so you have the gold standard of refuginess regarding within the Palestinian society versus others, and that still continues to play out again and again. And so I think that the United Nations puts out a lot of smoke. I'm not sure that it does more than that.
Okay, thank you for that insight. We have one more question for you, Richard, before I go to the audience questions. You've focused on the role of language in the dangerous anti-Semitic narratives, as you describe language as being weaponized and devalued in order to, quote, spark outrage and moral panic. I want you to discuss the use of language and how it's aided in inverting the narrative on the topic of Israel and the Palestinians, whether in the media, classroom, halls of Congress, even on Tucker Carlson or the set of Saturday Night Live. Words like apartheid state, occupation, human rights abuses, and on are being used to describe the conflict. But as we've been discussing this past hour, they're lies. And no matter how hard we try, we don't seem to be able to have an impact. Can you share with us how you see the distortion of language as a tool by the haters to further their agenda, and if we can do anything about it?
Actually, I'd actually start not with the haters, but with the hypercritics. Particularly the Jewish ones. I have a chapter in the book on Jews against themselves, which is a phrase of Edward Alexander's. And what I think it happens amongst Jews who are very critical of Israel, they see themselves as sort of in the prophetic vein, although no prophet ever went to Nineveh to denounce the Jewish people to their enemies. Whereas that's exactly what these people do, but it's a kind of prophetic rhetoric in which you exaggerate. So you accuse the Jews, a prophet will accuse the Jewish people or the Israelites of being like Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, they're not like Sodom and Gomorrah, but this is a way of sort of whipping them into shape. And so you have people who will say you're committing genocide it's apartheid, genocide against the Palestinians and so on. And these are all sort of rhetorical ploys that get taken seriously by the real haters, who then use it as a cudgel not to correct us, but to destroy us. So, the Jenin massacre meme that went out in 2002 led to a situation in which a plurality of people in many European countries actually agreed with the statement that Jews are committing genocide, Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people. Now, interestingly enough, I don't know of any poll that said, do you think the Palestinians want to commit genocide against the Jews in Israel? Which would have been an interesting thing to hear people, public opinion about. But the point that I'm making is that all of this language has been utterly degraded. I think racism is utterly degraded. You have to distinguish between prejudice and racism. It's not racist. Microaggressions are not racism. They're prejudice, and they're in many cases unthinking prejudice, but it's not a sort of ideology of the moral and physical and whatever else superiority of my race over your race. So in that sense, I think that we've completely lost the North, and we can't use language the way we should. So genocide still carries a terrible emotional and moral charge, but it's got nothing to do with the reality on the ground, where Palestinian and Arab Israeli populations continue to grow under Israeli sovereignty, as opposed to what happened to Jews under Nazi sovereignty. So again, it's a radical moral and empirical disorientation, which I argue, and this goes back to what Asaf was saying earlier. A lot of this stuff started, I wouldn't say it started in 48. In the Arab world, it started in 48, but in the West, it really started in 67 after the Six-Day War, and then gained speed, particularly in 82 and so on. But my argument about 2000 is that it's at this moment where stuff that was still on the margins, comparing Israel to the Nazis, even amongst leftist discourse, all of a sudden burst into the open and literally swept away just about anybody who wanted to object. And so now we're in a situation where we've lost the ability to think because we've lost our control of language. I'll stop there because I know other people have questions.
Thanks, Richard. I mean, you actually are a master of language that I'm not sure our viewers understand how good you are with things like you mentioned moral schadenfreude of the Jews and lethal journalism, and you come up with all these wonderful terms yourself. So we need to figure out how to.
I have a glossary in the book.
Yeah. Oh, good. Okay, so I'm going to go back. One of the questions relates to a topic, Asaf, that you touched on at the very beginning, which was left-leaning Jews versus right-leaning Jews and the divide within the Jewish community. And somebody asked, how do we wake up our left-leaning Jewish friends to the reality of anti-Semitism facing our American Jewish community? They think anti-Semitism is only from the right. They will argue and shut you up if you say anti-Semitism comes from the left. They always bring up Trump and the Charlottesville Nazis. And I'm just going to add a little personal anecdote here before you answer, and you both can chime in if you want. I tried to get my town to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and the one person who spoke up against it, and very vociferously spoke up against it, said, "Oh, I'm a Jew. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors. I've been to Israel twice. But yeah, we're not adopting IRA in our town because and the woman actually belongs to an organization that celebrates the Nakba, which the Palestinians call
commemorates, not celebrates.
Well, no, she celebrates it. I mean, so anyway, can you maybe, Asaf, you start, since this is something that you had just touched on at the beginning of the program?
I mean, I think that the danger of the left and the right in anti-Semitism includes both. And I think that in Antifa is no less dangerous than neo-Nazis. And I think that you have a convergence of the red, green, and brown alliance when it comes to hatred, when it comes to Jews. I think that where the left, and this is to Richard's point, seems to have the moral high ground and the way they use the media and projecting and defending the issues, but the hatred and the vitriol is there on the left and the right. I think that when you look at groups like from the left of center group, groups like the ADL and whatnot, like to, they can live with neo-Nazis. We can explain the hatred when it comes to those kind of the vitriol. It's much harder for them to come to terms within their own identity. And that's what I was saying before, what was happening in the academy, that these kind of values of human rights and environmental issues, they don't sit right with them. But the hatred is there. And I think we have to recognize that and understand the danger.
Yeah, one of the things that I'd say is that the difference between left and right-wing Jew hatred is that the right wing tends to be, they don't take a moral position. They actually take a defensive position. In other words, the Jews are trying to rule over us and trying to enslave us. This is the protocols of the elders of Zion, and we have to defend ourselves. So it's really a sort of, in a sense, it's a primitive form of Jew hatred. What you get on the left is moral high ground. And I remember at the turn of the millennium, I was participating in a yearly conference, and one of my colleagues, whom I really liked, would say to me every year, 2001, 2002, 2003, this time Israel has lost the moral high ground. And I kept thinking, how do you lose the moral high ground to people who teach their children to hate so much that they want to blow themselves up amongst your civilians? And I realized it wasn't that we had lost the moral high ground to the Palestinians, we had lost the moral high ground to the left. And the reason why the left loves stories of Jews behaving badly, the reason that they literally shep moral schadenfreude whenever they hear stories about how bad we are and who we've killed, like Shirin Abu Akleh, the reason why that's so exciting to them is that it makes them feel good about themselves. And that is, I think, a poison that is very hard to counter. You can counter, well, I have a quote at the beginning from Dietrich Bonhoeffer who says, you can counter evil, but stupidity, that's really hard.
So I'm glad you brought up Shirin Abu Akleh, because somebody asked a question to you, Richard, if you could talk about the investigation. And just for those who aren't familiar with this, Shirin Abu Akleh was a Palestinian American journalist who was killed in standing in the middle of a gunfight between the IDF and I guess it was Hamas, wasn't it, or Palestinian jihadists. And she was killed, and the Israelis did an investigation and came to the conclusion that it was likely maybe Israeli gunfire, an accident. And now the Biden FBI is doing its own investigation into this killing. And it's unheard of, and it's horrible, I think. So someone asked a question about this investigation, the FBI investigation, and connecting it to al Durah. Why is the Biden administration doing this?
Okay, so the first thing to understand is that there are parallels and not parallels. In the case of Adua, we don't even have a dead body. The body that was buried, the boy who was buried as Adua, a facial recognition expert did an analysis and said there's no way that the boy that the family identified as Muhammad was the one who was buried. In the case of Shirin Abu Akleh, she really died. I think the Adua thing was staged. We don't see any blood. The boy moves after he's been declared dead by the journalist and so on. So, and moves deliberately. So there are differences, but the key to the blood libel, the key to the really nasty, vicious, lethal narrative is that immediately Palestinians who were there claimed that the Israelis did it on purpose, that they targeted her. And that's the real key. If Muhammad al Durah had been killed by accident, it would be hard to say this picture replaces a picture that symbolizes the death, the deliberate murder of 1 million Jewish kids by the Nazis. So in this case, they immediately accused her of murder. One of the guys who did it is in my movie of Pallywood, which is footage I took from Pierre Rochov's movie about Jenin, in which the guy is actually caught on camera setting up a fake accusation of the Israelis preventing a woman from getting through a checkpoint to have a baby. So but immediately people accept this. And if you look at the reports from the New York Times, from CNN, from I think the Guardian or the BBC, or some British group, and from allegedly independent groups, they all give credibility to these Palestinian witnesses. And they only give credibility to these Palestinian witnesses when they accuse Israel of doing it deliberately. In fact, Pirachov has a movie about the Shirin Abu Akleh affair, and he points out that the witnesses were saying, oh, the gunfire came from above, whereas in fact that's where the Palestinians were, not the Israelis. So the actual evidence, the only reason to investigate this is the suspicion that Israel did it on purpose. If they accidentally killed the woman, there's no investigation to make. So it's the deliberate murder of Shirin Abu Akleh that the FBI is looking into. Now, you know, the Palestinians shared the bullet with the FBI, and the bullet was so damaged that it was impossible to tell anything. And the entire conduct of the Palestinian forensic unit collecting evidence and stuff was ludicrous. So there's really no case to be made. And yet the FBI is looking into this, as you say, unprecedented. And I think it's a really nasty piece of work. And I think that there are, as Gatestone has documented repeatedly, a whole bunch of people in the Biden administration who are really nasty anti-Israel activists, Hadi Amar amongst others. And I think that this is their work. And I think that it's a way for the Americans to try and exercise some kind of leverage on the current government to avoid it going too far to the right. And all of this fits into a larger framework, which is, I think, insane, and which is pushed by people like Dennis Ross and Martin Indyk, which is this insane idea that the two-state solution is the only solution that we have to pursue, and that every time Israel does something, it's quote unquote killing the two-state solution. Two-state solution was killed in 2000 when the Palestinians began an intifada, which was not an intifada, it was a jihad. And it was a suicide terror jihad. They made it clear that there was no deal to be had, and yet the peacemakers, the industry of peacemakers, continues to cling to this idea that if only we can get the Israelis to give a little more, then maybe we'll have peace. Whereas, in fact, the more the Israelis give, the more aggression they will inspire in the Palestinians.
We could spend a long time talking about that, the two-state solution. Asaf, I don't know if you wanted to add something, but I did want to ask one more question.
Yeah, no, I agree with Richard 100%. I mean, I just want to say that, you know, the latest article that came out of Aaron David Miller and Dan Kurtzer was another exemplifies, you know, conditioning military aid on all of that. And that's kind of the same industry that, you know, these people were involved in the peace industry. But I also think it's worth noting, and, you know, our friend and colleague, Ben Dror Yemini, wrote a whole book about the industry of lies. I mean, part of what was so significant and unique, what Richard talks about as well in his early work and now, had to do with the creation of a child martyr. And, you know, that came out of the Arafat, you know, came out of Arafat with the idea of creating that sympathy, a la martyrology, a la refuginess. These are the catchphrases that really create, you know, the kind of reaction, the emotional reaction that they're looking to create. But we have to make sure that it is a creation. It is a manifestation of an industry that is all based on falsehoods. And they use all these mediums to promote that.
Yeah.
So I just want to ask one more question before we go, and it's 1 o'clock, but there's a young woman who's a sophomore at GW who's listening.
I saw that.
So I want to go back to the academy because she said that the school admin, and thank you, Sabrina, for joining us and for your bravery. The school admin focuses on a shared community, quote unquote, where all can respect each other despite disagreements. Do you think this is even possible? Do you think the admin can play a role in bringing the two groups together to discuss their differences? What do you think can be done? What can she propose to students and to the administration to quell anti-Semitism?
Right. Well, look, one of the things that I suggest in the book is that it is in the interest of infidels, that is non-Muslims, to say to the Muslim community, if you can't get along with the Jews, then you can't get along with us either. It's basically the ability of the Arab world to get along with Israel, to have a positive some relationship with Israel, is a test case of your ability to get along with any other community. And the intolerance embodied in what Asaf refers to as this non-normalization, anti-normalization demand, that's an intolerance that says the people who are anti-Israel really are incapable of listening to the other side. And I think that one of the ways to appeal, and I'm not saying it's going to work, but one of the ways to appeal to administrations who want to create communities is to say, you've got to say to these people, they have to sit down and listen to our side, instead of screaming and yelling and creating moral panics in which Jews can't speak.
Asaf, do you want to add anything before we go?
Yeah, which is what happened last week, at CUNY. But I think that, to Sabrina's question, I mean, if there is going to be any conversation, the basic starting point has to be of recognizing, each other's right to exist. If they're not going to talk about existence, because usually they deny our existence, then there's nothing to talk about. And so this is part of the basic tenet of the conversation, which I think is also Richard's points to as well. I mean, you got to have a basic starting point. If you're not going to have, besides shouting, yelling, and canceling, then there's no conversation. Otherwise, discourse should be about actual discourse.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for joining us. It's after 1, so we're going to have to close. We have so many things we could continue to discuss, and maybe we'll do a follow-up webinar at some point in the near future. But Richard, your book, I wish you all the best with it. Maybe you could hold it up, and I don't know, you have to speak to have.
All right, let me just say in terms of the book that one of the things I suggest at the end is really find out what happened in 2000, because if you're going to be able to understand how things got so crazy, you really have to go back and understand how radically disorienting the moves that were made by progressives were back in 2000 and 2003. Ian Buruma in the New York Times says it's a litmus test of liberal credentials to be pro-Palestinian. And this is at the height of the suicide terror campaign. That's a complete corruption of what it means to be a liberal. And yet that's what happened. And until you understand that, and until you understand that the people, whether they know it or not, who repeat this nonsense are the damage that they're doing to our ability to think clearly about what it means to have a democracy and what it means to be a free people, there's not a lot you can do that's going to be very effective.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. When we get the recording, we'll send it out, and please share with everybody. I think we had a very important conversation this afternoon. Thank you all, and have a good afternoon. Thank you, Asaf and Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you.